previous videos, we mentioned about the conclusions for the research paper. It will be the last part of the research paper, giving the final notes to the readers, putting everything together to demonstrate that the entire research study comes in one piece and is properly designed to answer the research questions and brings to significant findings, which after acquiring these findings, there will be some thoughts of what next. We also mentioned about the components of conclusions, which were later elaborated in details in different aspects, and it was mentioned that the conclusion shouldn't be too long, which you will need to selectively choose those which is relevant, significant, and impactful that you present to the readers. It was also mentioned that constructing a conclusion is difficult. You may not be able to get a clear guidance which is custom-made to your research study as provided by your supervisor or the examiner. Now let us look into the do's and don'ts of writing the conclusions. Based on the common mistakes as highlighted in these slides, you can use this to do some self-evaluations so that you are able to produce the conclusions of better quality that best concluding your research study. Without further ado, let us look into it one by one. The first column represents what you should do for your conclusions, and the second column represents what you shouldn't do for your conclusions. You should include only findings presented previously, and you should not include new findings. You can rephrase your finding, provided that the findings is the same. The conclusion is not a place for you to introduce a new finding which have never been discussed in the discussions, as normally conclusions do not allow you to do further elaborations or discussions of the findings. Therefore, it is no point for you to make new findings in the conclusions unless it is well discussed. You should also base each conclusion soundly on material evidence previously stated. And you should not neglect to ensure that each conclusion is related to specific material presented previously. That means whichever conclusions that you have made, there should be a solid foundations, which on basis of the things that have been stated within your thesis in the previous section. The conclusions cannot come out from nowhere without any support from the things that you have mentioned in your thesis. Under such circumstances, your conclusions become irrelevant to your thesis. In doing the conclusions, you should make specific statements instead of making vague and generalized statements. These statements must be clear so that the readers is not confused with your statements. The conclusion should also include the interpretations of the result or observations, of course in the concise and the brief manner. It should not merely repeating the findings from the result and discussion sections without interpretations. You will need to present your conclusions in a meaningful manner instead of presenting it in terms of the informations to the readers. Pure informations normally is not that strongly bound to the reader, but if you are able to extract the meaningfulness of the result and the observations, it is easier to keep the reader engaged. You will need to be modest in stating the significance of your study, and you should not exaggerate the significance of your finding. You know that you are representing the research community in providing professional point of view, filling the knowledge gap, which is on basis of the rigorous investigations. Your statement should be objective, not to be too personal or emotional, and you should not be bogus about your findings. Don't overclaim the significance of your study for the sake of attracting the interest of the readers. This is your obligations as a researcher presenting the technical writings. You should also state the limitations of your research and recommend areas for future research, which you should not treat your research finding as the final words on the topic. That means you should not stop your conclusions with your findings. Instead, you will have to ask yourself, what's next? How your findings going to influence the future trend of the research study, or how it is going to impact the futures in the reality at a broader context. You will need to make sure the content in the introductions match those in the conclusions. You should not neglect to make sure that the introductions and conclusions are logically linked. This one you need to be careful, as most of the students may have these mistakes in their thesis. You know that in most of the conditions, the postgraduate students develop the introduction section, normally at the early stage of their research study, typically at the stage of the proposal defense, which is normally conducted within the first year of their postgraduate study. However, by the time you reach to the conclusions, it will be towards the end of your study, which will be the final semester or probably the extended semester from your postgraduate study. There will be a time gap between your introductions and the conclusions. Although you're supposed to produce your thesis in one piece as a whole, but you know that what actually happened is different chapters of your thesis normally come out at different stages of your research study. It is especially when towards the end of your research study, if you do not properly plan your work schedule, you will find your schedule quite tight at the end of the research study. This is where you are rushing to submit your thesis before the deadlines, being pushed by your supervisor as well as your postgraduate school. Then you finish everything in hurry. There is another possible reason of this. Because of the time gap between your introductions and the conclusions, there are certain critical points that, especially those in details, that you may not be able to fully recall. Therefore, normally there will be slight disconnections between the introduction and conclusions. To the students who are producing the thesis, it seems that the time gap between the introduction and the conclusions is quite long. As for the supervisor and examiner, they are reading from the first word to the last word. The time gap between the introduction and the conclusions is relatively short. Whichever come out in the introductions, it remains fresh in the minds of the supervisor and the examiner. And then when come to the conclusions, they should be able to quickly identify the differences between the introductions and the conclusions. This leads to a situation as if the introductions and the conclusions are talking about different things. With that, my recommendations to you that you can follow your normal pace of writing the sections in your thesis, which inevitably you're going to produce your introductions before the proposal defense. We know that somewhere after the proposal defense, when you want to realize your investigations into actions, there could be some fine-tuning, but most likely the variations from your initial proposal might not be that significant. You will have to review those along the way, and then when you reach to the final stage, which is the conclusions, you may construct the conclusions in accordance to the structures of your introductions, especially in the sequence of the objective as presented in the introductions. And then after you have constructed your conclusions, you will have to come back and revisit the introductions, going through the introductions, and then go straight back to the conclusion again. you will have to read the introduction and the conclusions as the final 2 chapters for you to complete your thesis, and the 2 chapters should be read concurrently. This is so that your entire research looks intact in one piece, instead of having 2 different things being declared with observable variations that will bring alarm to the supervisor and the examiners. You are also encouraged to include the limitation of your research and recommend for future development in your research topic. This one also often being forgotten by the postgraduate students, as they are eagerly to close your thesis after they have covered all the necessary main points as acquired from the research study. You know that the conclusion is not a summary, therefore there will be also inputs and afterthoughts that you have acquired after you have completed the research. The reader would like to know how you perceive your research after you have completed it.